Hi, Lou Pulsfer here to talk about another of those situations where we divide something into two or three categories in order to get some insight about the subject as a whole, subject to game design in this case. And here the two categories are games that are interesting decisions versus games that are wish fulfillment. So there's lots of ways to divide game design and games in general up. Many of these I've made videos for. Some of those are on my game design channel. Some of those are only available through my courses. So we can talk about games with human opposition versus those without. A fundamental divide greater than the divide between electronic games and non-electronic games. We can talk about the three possibilities of games that are all math, games that are about people, or games that are about stories. We can talk about linear games versus open world games, about mind control versus players who make their own story, about games versus puzzles, about the system and the psychological in games, about talent and technique in games, and so on. This time it's games as a series of choices, which is Sid Meier's classic definition of what a game is, versus games as wish fulfillment, as an experience, which sometimes is called role play, but some people want to raise it above role play and call it an experience. AAA video games have enabled the second kind of game in a way that traditional board and card games simply cannot, because of the possibility of photorealism and the activity within this story or the experience that you just can't get from a non-electronic game, except something like Dungeons & Dragons. Now, wish fulfillment can still have choices, but in a lot of cases, as the game designer or writer, depending on how they look at themselves, works on the game, they eliminate the larger choices in order to guide the story to a conclusion. So the player has the smaller choices, how to attack a particular enemy, but not the larger choices, as in, say, Mass Effect 3, where apparently despite all the emphasis of the developers on your decisions making a difference, in the end, they didn't. The end was the same, pretty much. Now, as I said, role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons provide the bridge between these two, because you can play a role-playing game either way. You can play it as a kind of wish fulfillment, or you can play it as something like a war game, where interesting choices are what counts. And some role-play game systems encourage one or the other. There are role-play game systems that are entirely about experience almost. There's not much gameplay there. And other role-playing game systems where gameplay is paramount. A referee can push the game one way or the other, but the game rules themselves can make a strong influence. Now, as I say, Dungeons & Dragons is a bridge between the two, and as most people know, video games in general, especially the experience or role-playing video games, owe a great deal to Dungeons & Dragons. Is one of these two ways better? No. The interesting choices are the traditional way of games, and the experiences is the new way of games. And puzzles are something else again that sort of have both involved, but it depends on the puzzle. And I'll confess that I'm mostly in the choices camp. A game is a series of interesting choices, except when I play D&D, I imagine myself being in the place of my character. And in that respect, it's a sort of wish fulfillment. I get to be the good guy with the white hat. I'm not like some people who play role-playing games where they see themselves as an actor fulfilling a role, and they'll do whatever the role requires. That, to me, doesn't seem like wish fulfillment as much as acting. Now, the question for you is, what kind of games do you want to make? But you always have to remember, no matter what kind of game you want to make, you probably have to start learning games by learning how to make good gameplay. not necessarily about learning experiences. And that's partly because creating an experience, especially in a video game, is quite difficult and very time consuming, and that's why I listed them as AAA video games. Your casual video games, your simple video games, your small video games are not going to provide any more wish fulfillment than your typical board or card game, and maybe less.